Yay. Today, we're going to be talking about origin stories of RCD programs. So again, this follows up on the series we've been looking at in terms of what factors characterize a given program or service group that you're running at your campus or at your institution. Today, we're going to be talking about origin stories. And really what we were thinking about with this is, how did you put together your program? And it may be that you were starting from scratch, or it may be that you came in at a time of transition. And really we're thinking about how do we transform this, and talk a little bit about, and this is just a shared discussion among ourselves, and talk about what were the key things that led to the decisions and how you shaped where you were going to go with your program. Who were some of the other key players and other things that influenced what you were going to do with your program and how you actually got it up and going. I think it'd also be really interesting if we shared some of the lessons learned about things that might have gone better or that we had to learn the hard way as we moved along through our journey. So with that, I'm going to stop the screen share. And we can see each other and have a proper discussion. So I've more than once shared a story of how I got involved at UC Berkeley, and I'm happy to share that today. But I don't want to jump in and take over to begin with. So is there anybody who's willing to step up and talk about, what was it like getting a program going where you were? Greg's got his hand up. Thanks for volunteering.
Yeah, why not? I'm only here to volunteer. So let me lower that hand. So we're smack in the middle. So we are starting up a new group here at NCAR called NCAR Research IT. So we're literally starting an RCD program as we speak. We just hired the director of that program about 4 months ago. People don't even quite report to him yet. So we are smack in the middle of this, right? The way we're doing it is sort of born out of my frustration at how I saw RC done at previous places, especially Penn State, where it was very much scattered all over the place. So there was a nice solid central IT group, a nice solid HPC group, and really nothing in that whole RCD space in between that would help researchers, regardless of discipline. So what we're trying to do here is, and look, I won't say this was, my doing it all. Like I've been here 2.5 years. They started talking about an NCAR Research Center of Excellence 7 years ago. So this took 6.5 years to put in place. So the last 2.5 years was me encouraging it along. But what we try to do is explicitly organize ourselves in a way that I've seen sort of implicitly organized in a lot of other places. And when going to conferences, like you hear the RCD group started up because there was a cluster in engineering 15 years ago, and then that over time became an RCD group. So there's a lot of ways these things happen. What we're trying to do is just be very explicit about it and end up in a situation where we have 3 groups providing the complete range of support. So an enterprise IT group on one end doing sort of large scale, scalable IT services that can be used by everyone, supercomputing and large scale research data group at the other end doing all that sort of giant supercomputing, giant research data that can be used by everyone and our national customers. And then in between that research computing and data group that is very much mission specific, value added, lab specific, really helping the researchers specific, so research specific. So all the stuff that kind of doesn't scale worth a crap that you need to throw more resources at. It requires more technical knowledge of the domain, so domain specific knowledge. So we're really trying to cram our domain specific people, research specific people, unscalable, like multiple, like individual server support, not just setting up a server, but running that server internally. Like that kind of stuff we're trying to get in one group so that what we can hopefully do over time is, maybe don't tell my enterprise IT people this, but like we want to sort of shrink the number of resources in the easy stuff, like generic IT, so that we can expand the number of resources in that research computing and data support space. Because ultimately, that should be the goal of the CIO, is to put the resources where they add the most value to the organization. And for us specifically as a research organization, research is where we add the most value. So that's the origin story here. I will let you know a year from now if it went well or not. So there you go.
Thanks, Greg. That's great. If folks have questions specifically to anybody, feel free to pipe up. But and we can also just sort of go, and revisit as we get around through the discussion. But there's a couple of other people who have hands up. Scott, you're next.
So I guess the very beginning for the University of Alberta was the very first computer bought on campus was for research back in the late 50s or early 60s. I do not say this authoritatively. I was not there. But anyway, more recently, in the late 80s and early 90s, the university bought their first SGI machine that took up a few racks. And so they formed a group around that and then aggregated other universities into that, which was then called MACI, which morphed into the regional organization that was WestGrid, because of the heavy use of that sort of thing by particle physicists that were on the Atlas project and other things that came later. The group grew to about 12 people, half of which were involved in visualization. Then a budget cut came, and so the group shrank to about 4, and it got buried into the enterprise IT Unix sysadmin group, and got ignored by a couple of the executive directors of enterprise IT. It was resuscitated in about 2014. I came aboard as the director. I've been at the university for 29 and a half years, but I was over in chemistry originally. And the group has grown slightly, and along with that, we have the regional organizations, but also we had Compute Canada for just about a decade. We now have the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, which replaced it and incorporated RDM and research software as well. Biru, who's on the line, is at one of the host sites. And Matthew from UBC, they have a slightly different approach where they have a large local cluster, but also make use of those national systems. So I don't actually have a large cluster right now at the University of Alberta, which is Canada's 5th largest research university. We make use of the national system. So we participate in the provision of those services. And I have the people that lean into that national provision, but I also have a couple of people that are not directly involved in that and are more aligned with the researcher facing things. I have someone who's a digital grants advisor. You can be the world's expert in underwater basket weaving, but not be able to describe to a granting agency how the digital research element fits into that grant. She's there to help them make that case and not sound like they don't know what they're talking about with respect to digital research infrastructure and the like. I also have someone who's fostering communities of interest. So these can be self-sustaining groups of graduate students, postdocs, and the like around either a research tool like R, MATLAB, bioinformatics, whatever it might be, or, well, not bioinformatics, but or in a field that's heavily oriented to digital research techniques like bioinformatics, digital humanities, digital social sciences, and the like. So yeah, that's where we're at today.
Boom. Thanks for that, Scott. Henry's got his hand up, and he always tells a good story.
Okay, well, my story starts very sad, but then gets way better. So back in 2000, my brother passed away, and it was just about as awful as you would imagine. And so a lot of what I was doing to cope with that was being on the phone with friends and talking and, starting with that topic, and then it would become random stuff. And I was talking with a colleague who, in fact, is now a member of our team, but at the time was just a researcher at our institution. And, it through various ramblings eventually got to ranting about how there were a lot of people on campus doing HPC and nobody collaborated with each other. And if we would just get together, we could maybe get like a little 32 node cluster or something, and everybody would benefit, and yada, yada, yada. And I was just ranting, and he thought I was proposing an idea. So he went to his boss and said, hey, Henry has this great idea. And his boss said, that is a great idea. Tell Henry to do that. So he came back and said, my boss says you should do that. And I was like, do what? So we created like a little brown bag group of people who are interested in HPC. And we did that for about a semester, just getting together every few weeks and just talking about stuff. And then the new CIO and the VP for research got wind of that, and they got very interested. And this was back when the university was not completely broke. And so suddenly they wanted to have an HPC center. And for reasons that remain opaque to me to this day, they wanted me to be in charge. I think because when they asked for volunteers, everybody took one step back. So suddenly I was in charge of a thing that didn't exist. And then after a little while, it did exist. And then it had money to buy machines. And we've been in business and in production continually for over 2 decades now. And really, it's actually gone shockingly well, particularly considering that we've never had a strategy or even really particularly a tactic. We just have an approach, which is try and provide the best capability we possibly can to the maximum possible number and variety of researchers. And it's worked pretty well. And the fact that I've managed not to get fired in 20 years suggests that that's actually the case. And we just last year did a blue ribbon review panel where our panelists were some major national folks like Dan Stanzione at TAC. And it went great. And a big part of their answer was Henry's group is great, but they need more money for people. And lots of other stuff as well. But it was nice to have that feedback. And I certainly will never disagree if someone says Henry needs more money. There's tons of other detail I can tell, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Well, that was great, Henry, and congratulations on the results of your blue ribbon panel. It is always nice to have somebody from the outside say, yeah, they're doing good, help them more. So Kirk's got his hand up.
So I actually have 2 stories. One is how I actually got started. Basically, I was in the central IT organization, and I had the interesting talent of being able to figure out things. So all of the weird problems that people would ask, and if it wasn't installing a printer or getting Office to work, it usually came across my desk. And then it's like, okay, well, let's see what we can do. And then I started pursuing graduate degrees. And after I started my doctoral program, I convinced my CIO of, well, you know, maybe we need somebody to actually pay attention to this full time. And so I was able to transition to that. And my justification was that we had tenure track faculty who were starting at Geneseo and didn't have the support that they had at their other institutions. And so I started working on all kinds of different problems of digital humanities, working with a NMR machine, particle accelerator, all kinds of different things. And then RIT offered me an interesting opportunity. So I was able to get sort of a RCD program started at Geneseo, which is a small 4-year liberal arts school, public liberal arts school. And it started getting things done, working with faculty and undergraduates. But then I started at RIT 3 years ago. And basically, it is a reboot of research computing there, where before it was under the VPR, and they moved it under the CIO. And it's like, okay, we need somebody who understands IT but then understands research. And that's where it becomes a very interesting space of, and somebody said before that, enterprise IT does enterprise IT wonderfully. And then departmentals do departmentals well, but a centralized research IT needs to be able to do sort of both sides of the equation. And I'm fortunate enough to lead a team that was sort of cobbled together from the old research computing group and some IT folks. And now we're in that bootstrap method of, okay, we've got the IT down, we've got some of the research down, but how do we do the value add for the researchers in the specific areas of IT that enterprise IT isn't equipped to do? Laboratory instrumentation, dealing with, oddball scientific packages and such. So that's sort of how I've gotten into research IT, and it's been an interesting time ever since.
Thanks, Kirk. Does anybody else want to jump in, or there's several of us who regularly tell our stories, so I know that I can just point at people and make them tell theirs.
So Patrick, Mike Nowicki from Mississippi State. I'll give two stories, right, from Mississippi State's origins and my own personal, if you're still looking for stories. Oh, so Mississippi State, back in 1990, 100 years ago, right? NSF grant, Engineering Research Center, focusing on computational fluid dynamics. It was an 11-year program, got revalidated every 3 years. And then in 2001, when the funding stopped, we were seeded and we were established and kind of had our own program going. That's when we became the High Performance Computing Collaboratory, is what we're called there. And the focus, it was still high performance computing, but it was focused on interdisciplinary studies. So right now we have 7 different research institutes that are part of our collaboratory here. The research is not related in any such way, except that they need high performance computing. So we have some UAV research, we have some foundational fundamental research, we have some genomics, some cybersecurity. We still do computational fluid dynamics, self-driving cars. So we've got a lot of stuff there. But as everybody knows, right, problems don't get solved by one. You don't have just a bunch of chemists sitting in a room solving problems, or mechanical engineers. It's an interdisciplinary team. In fact, we've got one project that has like 12 social scientists involved on it, because they're trying to define like how is this going to change my life problem, and then we're putting it into numerical numbers to create the models for it. So it's a really cool institution to be part of. I tell that story very much secondhand because I've only been here for a couple of years, and my journey into supercomputing is probably more odd. I mean, no more odd than anyone else's. But I was actually just retired from the Air Force in the summer of 21. I was a computer science math undergrad, came into the Air Force to be a cyber person, back in 99/2000. Did that for a couple years. They were not using me as a technical expert, which is kind of the traditional way that a cyber officer was used. So I applied for pilot training, and I flew for the Air Force until about 2016, until the Air Force said, hey, we've got these aircraft that have a lot of cyber stuff involved in them, and we're trying to stand up a CISO office in the Pentagon. So went to the Pentagon for about a year, got back into cyber. It was really great. Cyber and computing always had kind of a hobby sideshow for me, and I was always very interested in just the fact that the military was taking it very, very seriously. And then in 2016, just had the opportunity to kind of stick around there. Again, through dumb luck, met somebody that was hired at Mississippi State University, and it was just what a great organization they have here. And I will say, my wife is from Philadelphia, Mississippi, so she was very excited to be able to come home too. So that's kind of my two-pronged story, institutional and personal. Thanks.
Well, I don't see anybody else leaping in, so I'll jump in and tell my story, and then maybe I'll start pointing at other people. So this is not where I currently am. This is where I was before I came here, which is at UC Berkeley. And some of this connects to the UC system at large, which Claire can also help fill out. There had been an attempt to build a system-wide high-performance computing resource. There was a pair of them, Sharks North and South. And they basically put a bunch of money into building clusters and supporting them at a systems level, but they didn't actually provide much in the way of research engagement support or campus level support. And as you might expect, that meant that people who already knew how to use it were happy and nobody else was even aware of it. As a result, it did not get a lot of utilization. And when it was time to refresh, there was no real support to refresh, which meant that it went away. And people are often surprised to hear that, you know, when I got involved, which was 2013, that there was no central computing resource at Berkeley. Maybe because they had enough research funding that they could follow the dysfunctional path of having lots of departmental clusters, which we have seen, right? Everybody's seen some of those. But the researchers were actually getting dinged on proposals because they said they were going to build more, you know, of an Astro cluster, and NSF was saying, you know what, we think that's not a very good way to do things, and you really ought to be contributing to a central resource. And so 11 researchers from a bunch of different domains went to the VCR and said, we need this, we need a central computing resource. Fortuitously, there was a new CIO who'd come in, and what I learned later that the CIO was told that supporting research was a non-goal as far as they were concerned for his role, but he had come from a place where and had a history of supporting research and really believed in it. So when the VPR approached him and said, hey, can we do anything about this? He said, yes, totally, let's do it. And in fact, I will come with some one-time money to bootstrap it. And there had been, you know, a history of some challenges between the office of the CIO and the VPR. So that was a big shift when he did that. And the two of them then went to the chancellor and said, hey, we want to work together on this. Can you give us some money? And the chancellor was so stunned to have these two figures come saying they wanted to work together that they said, yeah, okay, well, let's give it a shot. What was interesting was that in order to get support across the faculty for this, it was made clear to us very early on that if this was just going to support the usual suspects, that there was going to be revolt. And you know, at Berkeley, as they used to quip, the 9-to-1 is a tie. And so if they had departments that were complaining about this, it was going to be a really difficult thing. And so we did a long series of listening tours about what people wanted. And what was interesting is that we definitely had the traditional HPC users who said, yes, we need a big cluster and we need good support for it. And you should talk to the people at Lawrence Berkeley Lab because they know how to run clusters. But a lot of other people said, I don't even know why we're building a cluster. Everybody should move to the cloud. And then we had other people who said, we just need somebody to help us even get software up and running. We don't, you know, there was a big digital humanities group, but they obviously didn't have a lot of expertise. And so it became clear that we were going to have to build a program that had some of the kinds of elements that others of you have talked about. There was HPC, cloud support, not running a cloud, and then support for like scalable workstations for either secure or just straightforward software that could scale beyond a workstation or a laptop. And so, you know, we set out to do that. And I think the other thing was we had a couple of big institutes on campus. There was the social science D Lab that had already been doing a lot of training. And so roping them in and saying, hey, can we count on you to do a lot of the basic software training? And they said, you know, absolutely. And we built this sort of loose network of providers on campus that we thought of as a bunch of adjunct staff to actually help out. And that ended up being a really important aspect of it, is to really recognize that there was no way we were going to get the budget early on to have lots of training and lots of support and being able to cover all these different domains. And so a lot of it was running around and recruiting people from the library. We had a really good couple of libraries on campus that had data librarians, and we ended up investing in a shared resource to do research data management between our group and the library. And that was a really important bridge. And so I think of the origin of a lot of this was both the demand from researchers saying we have to have this, but as well recognizing that with a pretty limited budget, we were going to have to get pretty creative and build a network of providers on campus. And that ended up really characterizing how we approached it. And it worked out really well. And it's, I left when it was time to go into production mode and just turn it over to straight production resource. But it's continuing, and they have, all of these different services that way in a lot of partnerships on campus. So that was our story. Who else would like to jump in and tell a story? Come on, folks, don't be shy. I'll just start calling on people. Dana?
You want me to tell a story?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll tell it about Oklahoma State. And those of you that have seen the talk I used to give when I was there about 4 years ago now, it's like the cyber infrastructure from scratch. So let's see. So they started with, I think it was around 2005 or 6 with some faculty members who had, their own lab clusters that did stuff, and a vice president for research who had been a computational physicist. So they were ripe for having something happening. And so they decided, and you'll appreciate this, that they would get centralized, have the CIO put up a cluster, and then they would just have a graduate student run it. So that's the laugh line, right? Because we all know how well that goes. And grad students are wonderful, but they do eventually graduate, unless you sabotage them in some way, and then they'll stick around. So they did figure out they hired a staff member to run it. And I think, that was great. It went on that way for a couple of years. And that person left. And that's when I came in as a failed mathematician with need of a job. And I could spell HPC. So it was a one-person shop. It was me. They had already a 64 node cluster. I reported to the CIO when I started, and they had 19 users, right? So in hindsight, this is how many users you end up with if you have one person doing it, and the people who use it are the physicists and chemists who already know how to use HPC. And so about 2 weeks on the job, I met my friend Henry Neiman at the other Oklahoma university. And then he introduced me to the big community, and I learned a lot more about all the different ways that you can reach out to all the various departments and all of that kind of thing. And it grew really fast. So by the end of my second year, we had over 200 users, and then it basically just doubled. And so Henry will remember my endless complaining about this is too hard, because I was now the system facing person, the researcher facing person. I may have written just a wee bit of very bad software at one point, and the strategy and policy facing, which I didn't know anything about. Again, mathematician, don't know anything about strategy. And so I think it was, I'm going to blame Henry for everything here. He convinced me to write an NSF proposal. With the trick being is you write that it's a major research instrumentation proposal, you write that, and you use the cost share to get your university to commit to hiring a staff person. And you get them to sign a letter, keep a copy of the signed letter that says that they will sustain that position indefinitely. And so that was when I got to hire my first staff member and continue on. That was, when would that have been? 2012, I think. So we kept going along those lines. I think another few years later, another major research instrumentation grant. We got in really good with the state EPSCoR program. I don't know if I need to explain what EPSCoR is, the experimental, no, it's established program to support research. It's the 29 states in NSF language that get less than 0.75% of federal funding. So they have this statewide track 1 program. I think back then it was maybe $15 million. It's $20 million now for a 5-year grant. And back in the olden days, they were really, they found cyber infrastructure really important. And so we had the CI plan, and it made it where we could share our resources with the state. And then, but again, thanks to Henry, who's been one of my biggest mentors and cheerleaders during that time, we were able to grow our program and get build more resources thanks to the EBSCOR funding to build, like, I call it a mini jet stream, and hire another person for that, and ended up with about five people on staff, including communications, which made a huge difference. And gosh, where does the story end? I think it hasn't ended. So, you know, as you mostly know, I got involved with Campus Champions and CARC and all of that stuff and moved to Internet 2 in 2019. My successor, who's there now, recently got a $4 million major research instrumentation grant to build a shared resource for Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Kansas. So the program continues. I'm glad, because, you know, I felt like it was my baby, and now it's continued to flourish in my absence. And I think the lessons is that, you know, community helps, because I learned so much about how to build a program and what kinds of things could be effective from the community, and even more so now, and hoping to pay that forward. And grad students are great, but they can't be everything. And that's about it.
You know, Dana, I'm just going to follow up a little bit. Thank you so much for mentioning the community aspect of that. You know, when I got into it, I knew nothing about HPC. I will say I was an IT architect and had done all sorts of software development. I'd worked on research a lot, but I would never have been able to get it off the ground if I hadn't been introduced to people like Ruth Marenshaw, who had run HPC for a long time and had recently moved to Stanford, and so was nearby. And Kurt Hilligus at Princeton was also really generous with his time in terms of telling me, okay, if you're going to run a condo program, you got to think about it this way, and you don't want to do this. And, you know, if you can avoid recharge, it's a really good thing. And, you know, and help me understand how to match all these issues of what goes into a program for research, computing, and data, and how to match that to your culture and figure out what's going to fly and what's not going to fly. And that was just unbelievably helpful. And that's something I was so impressed with in the community, is how generous people were of their time in terms of trying to help out how to bootstrap something like that. So big shout out to everybody in the community around that. Unless there's another volunteer, I have another prospective victim that I'm just going to point at. Jay Shri is on the call from George Mason, or she was, unless it's
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, good. Jay Shri, tell us your story.
Okay, I'll start. I did my PhD in computer science, and I postdoc for a few years, and then decided I didn't want to be a full-time faculty because I was raising two little ones. And at that time, Mason had lots of small clusters. It was in 2010-11 timeframe, and they decided, oh, we need to have central services. So they did a study, and at that time, the VPR and CIO were on the same page. And so they all signed this agreement saying, we'll start the central office and we'll have a part-time director and a full-time facilitator. And that's how I got the job. And I got there because I knew a little bit of HPC and MPI, and I knew I could help some of the facts. And I know how to install software because I used to maintain Linux systems as part of my undergraduate and graduate work. So that's how I got started. But then, you know, it's always a revolving door at the top. So I, like Dana, I was the single person for a long time till we got a permanent VPR who said, oh, we need a systems administrator. And so in 2017, we became a two-person shop. And I should say, I'm really thankful for the community. I became a campus champion in 2013, and I've learned so much from this community. And like what Dana and Patrick said, I had no clue how to support users. So it's been a nice learning experience, and everybody is friendly and gives me lots of help when I need it. And with Dana and Henry's presentation on how to write an NSF MRI proposal, I did write one in 2020, and we got the funding because there was no funding from the university to build a new cluster. So all that, we got a new cluster in 2020, and it's slowly been growing, but we don't have permanent funding, or, you know, and the way it was set up, our office reports to the VPR and a dotted line to the CIO, but most of the services support comes, we need to be closely tied with ITS. And like as I was mentioning, there's been so much churn and turnover at the senior management. We're still struggling to see how to build a cohesive unit where both the systems facing and the researcher facing can be in one group. Right now, the systems facing is in ITS reporting to the enterprise folks, and they have no clue about research computing. So every time I have to go and, tell them why this has to be done and how do you support researchers. So we did do a study, Patrick was, I convinced both the CIO and the new VPR to let me hire a consultant to study to see how we can reorganize so that we can have a proper budget, we can have a roadmap, we can have people to hire and do all our work and support the growing R1. We are an emerging R1. We got R1 status in 2016, and we got another approval, I think, in 2018. So research is growing by leaps and bounds, and we are not funded to support it. So right now, I did all this study, and the best part was the CIO left right at the end of this. So now I'm, educating the interim CIO. So it's a work in progress, but I'm hopeful by the end of this year, with all these stories that I'm hearing, I can go back and sell another, teach our senior management that why we need to support the researchers. And that's my story. And it's, like I said, it's still work in progress. It makes me laugh sometimes that it's never ending progress. It never reaches the point where I can say I'm done.
Yeah, that's a common theme. Thank you, Jayshree, for sharing that. So lots of different stories. Is there anybody else who wants to even tell some anecdotes or some observations or echoes of what they've heard from their own programs? I'm sure some of these things resonate, but you may have some different takes on some of this. Please jump in and speak up if you do.
Really briefly, you can make a lot of progress if you focus on somewhere where your institution or region or however you're laid out is lacking in a service, and you express an interest in providing that service. And so our national provision works very, very well for general purpose computing, but does not work particularly well for sensitive data research, biomedical, defense, sociology, things like that. And so I've gotten a lot of traction locally at the university by identifying that as a lack in service. And I've gotten the VPR and the VP Finance and the CIO all on board to support that. And we'll get started on that as soon as the province okays it here in a couple of weeks. So sometimes exploiting where maybe things aren't great can drive things forward for the entire organization, because you may already be doing a very good job of everything else.
I think it's a really good point. I think it's also really important to make sure that if you do that, you tell that story, because people may not be aware of it. One of the kind of weird things was that the team that I was able to pull together included a guy who'd been an English major, but was, had 15 years of IT architecture experience, and a Slavicist who had been involved in digital humanities programs with me, who was just amazing and helped organize our consulting program. And they both were really good at helping us craft the stories that we then put out to say, hey, here's this researcher and they couldn't do anything before, and here's how we helped them, and this is what we did. And that made such a difference in going from that initial funding to sustaining. And so I've always been a huge advocate of that. And I see Claire's got her hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. I would kind of do a big +1 on what Scott said about understanding kind of what gaps exist. That's been a big to bring it back to the strategy facing part of this. That's been a big strategy for my program, is to identify the gaps. There are a lot of service providers on our campus who are doing stuff. We're a very successful R1 before Research IT became a formal group. And so in many ways, we had to jump into a pool that already had a lot of participants. And so then that became kind of a tricky thing from a political standpoint. And so it was very important that I consider that part of my strategy was about the gaps that existed on our campus. And that's where we have been able to really flourish, is because we just slide into these little spots where, I mean, we're fortunate to have the San Diego Supercomputer Center on our campus. So we didn't start as a CI center providing a cluster or something like that. That's not, we started at the other end. We started on the researcher facing side of things and pointing people to services. And we just then kind of moved toward a cluster, and now we do have a baby cluster, but again, it's not one that competes, and who could compete with SDSC, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard that kind of a story before, Claire, where there is a cluster on campus, but it's only the people in a department who know how to use it, and then they're told, okay, you got to make this more broadly available. But then that means you need a group like what Claire is describing to actually help people learn about it and figure out how to use it. Susan, do you want to speak up? I see you just dropped it. No.
As soon as I did it, I was like, I'm going to get called on. But no, it's very similar. And, Claire's been a great resource, as have all of you over the last several years. But I'm at NC State, and we already had an existing HPC group. My first position was actually shared between the libraries and OIT to bring together research data management expertise with like the folks providing the data storage. And now we've got a research facilitation group. And our main goal is to identify gaps, try to fill gaps, and point to existing resources, and advocate for additional resources for folks that are struggling to meet the capacity. And so that's what we're doing. And so I think, a lot of what Claire said, and a lot of what you said, Patrick, about research data management within the libraries and the partnering between the groups. That's sort of what we're aiming to do. And our team we have half of our team is in the libraries and half of our team is within the research computing unit and OIT. So we're kind of a matrix team.
Thanks. Sorry to put you on the spot, Susan. Anybody else want to share even an anecdote or an observation on something they've heard that makes sense to them, or just some aspect of your own experience that you could share with us? Melissa, do you want to talk at all about, you've just jumped in to the deep end at Rice. Do you want to share just a couple of observations on how that's going?
Sure. I was actually trying to figure out how to frame some of this, or if I should just be quiet today. Yeah. So interesting. Very briefly, the backstory here, the origin story for Rice is that they started out with an HPC center and cluster, I want to say about 15 years ago. It's been a long time. And they were, early on, Rice was actually in there with all the early, even, sort of comparable systems at that time with some of what was happening at what we now considered sort of the national flagship resources. But of course, as funding continued to shift toward those big centers, and over time, we did have an MRI or two, and then a couple CC stars here. But as the funding started to shift with NSF, being needing to support cyber infrastructure and compute across many, many more institutions, the funding shift happened. And we still run a pretty big cluster here. We have a couple different systems. We have we have a big HPC, HTC system. We run a small cloud system with VMs. And we have then a controlled information system where we have sort of an enclave set up there. So we're running those things, but the gap here is in a couple different directions. One is sort of a mandate to start to really provide access toward a much broader set of researchers on campus. So not only serving the people who need to use HPC. Early on, sort of about 5 years ago, the path was, look, we're going to support these people on HPC. We'll get them up and running, provide them access, do the training. And then as their needs grow or their need for computation grows, we'll funnel people to the national resources. You can imagine then 5 years later, a pretty big gap in terms of how we get people oriented and get them on, but also there are less people here interested in necessarily moving over to the national resources. They either want on-prem or they want their own clusters, and managing sort of how to figure out what the policies will be around who should actually buy their own systems or not, how all that's going to happen is changing. And then of course, all the other areas in terms of discipline we're not supporting yet, how to begin to get folks supported for research computing. So really broadening the service footprint on campus is my goal and need. And that also means working with the enterprise side of OIT and campus services on that side of OIT to start to get some policies in place that sort of will help us support the research community in some different ways. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Melissa. We're coming up near the top of the hour. There's a question to a couple of folks, Claire and Susan, in the chat, but one of the things we can always do is carry over the discussion into the call doc after the call. And so if anybody wants to share comments or pose questions or add things, you can keep on whacking away in the call doc. But I want to make sure that we don't run over, because everybody's many of you will have other meetings to get to and things like that. But thank you everybody for showing up and sharing your stories. This is really interesting, really fun. And join us. We'll let you know if we're going to go straight to the impact stories and metrics next time or not. We'll get that out. I'll make that decision soon. Thanks in no small part to our steering committee, who I will again give a shout out to. And with that, I hope everybody has a great rest of your week, and we will see you again in May.
Thanks, everybody.